Welcome back to the TPR 86cc build series. In the last video you saw me working on a nut style drive adapter so that I can use the scooter's crankshaft to drive a kart racing style water pump. In this video I'm going to try to mount the kart pump to the engine, and I'm going to do some testing and find out if I can come up with a working setup or not. After looking around, I know that I want to mount the water pump up in this area, largely because there really aren't a lot of choices. At least up here I do have one threaded hole in the area for a bracket. If you move down here, there's really nothing to work with, and then all back here is obviously blocked by the exhaust and the frame, etc. So it pretty much has to be in this area. Now I'm thinking I'll have a bracket that comes off of this bolt and just goes up here so a bolt can go here. I'm not sure. I may want to add a second bolt in the engine just so that the bracket can't swivel. If I do, I will probably have to drill something in back here, I guess, because when they did Larry's setup, they just welded onto the frame or onto the case here another piece of aluminum and they could put a bolt through it. I'm not going to weld aluminum. I can't weld aluminum, and I don't really want to take it out to have that done, so I'm just going to see what I can work with. I'll start with just a bracket, just a flat bracket coming off of here, hopefully to attach this to this. This is what I've come up with after messing around with cardboard for a bit, and I think it should put everything in a suitable location. I should be able to align these two ports here, and the inlet on the back should be high enough to clear the cylinder. So now I've just got to take this thing off of here and transfer the cardboard design onto some 1/8 inch steel. I think this should be alright. It looks like the alignment down here will be fine, and I think the alignment or the height above the cylinder will be fine in the back there, but I've picked up two of these hoses with 90-degree bends, so I'm just going to make sure before I move any further on with a bracket that it does appear that these things should be in the right spots. The hoses look like they're going to be alright. As you can see, I've got the seat bucket on here, and I've got more than 1 inch of clearance between the top of this bracket and the bottom of the seat bucket, so that's not going to be an issue. So the only other thing I want to check before I move on with the bracket is to make sure that one of the belts that I have is going to work. I got a small collection of belts here. I've got a 180, 160, 150, 140, and a 130 XL. And pretty much if you took a decimal point and put it behind the first two numbers, so that'd be an 18.0, 16.0, etc., that would be 18 inches around if you measured around the outside diameter of this belt, 16 inches for the 160, 15 for the 150, and so on. And I had a couple of these around. The 180 was for the lathe, the 160 was from the router test rig, and then I ordered the other three because I wanted to make sure I had something around that would work with this, and these were only about $6 each, so I'm just going to try and find which one is the closest. That's a 160, and to put tension on the belt, I don't like the angle here of the outlet, so I'm going to see if maybe a 150 will work. I think the 150 is going to be what I go with because I can slip it over the pulleys and I can put a little more tension on it and get this outlet of the water pump aimed right at the inlet of the cylinder. It should be just about right. What I want to do now is to make this bracket more secure so that it can't swivel. So I'm hoping to add a piece across here, a piece of steel that can bolt onto the cases, which I'll have to drill and tap the case. Probably M6 by 1.0, just like this is. And that way the base of this bracket can't swivel, and the only motion that you'll really get is up here with the actual single bolt for the water pump. But to do this, I think it's going to be a whole lot easier outside the scooter, and really I don't think I can drill that and tap it inside the scooter, so I'm going to have to go ahead and take the engine out. Whenever I've taken this engine off, ever since I've got this racing exhaust on here, I've been just leaning it up against the wall when I work on it or propping it up on something, and I'm kind of tired of that. I could take the exhaust off and put the center stand on every time, but I came up with a different quick solution. I used some 1-inch square steel tubing, a piece of 1 1/4 1/8-inch thick flat bar, and a couple of pieces of 1-inch by 1/8-inch thick angle iron, and just came up with this quick little stand that should bolt to the center stand section here. I'm going to see if I can get it up there, and I'll also show you real quick how this went together, just in case you're interested. Perfect, but it's a whole lot better than having to set this thing over on its side. It should be really nice if I wanted to put it up here and work on the cylinder, something like I'm doing now, CVT work, whatever it is that I've got to have it up on the workbench for. I do want to do one more thing before I move on to finish the bracket, and that is to get a bolt that fits through here without so much slop. So this thing measures 9 millimeters on one end and 8.5 on the other, so I'll go ahead and drill that out so it's even. But you can see the 8mm bolt I have here wiggles around quite a bit. No metric or standard sizes that are larger than this will actually fit through there that I have. So I'm going to go ahead and take a larger bolt and cut it down to the diameters that I want, and then I'll just rethread the end of it. This is much better than the old bolt. Before I actually cut the second piece of the bracket, what I've done is I mounted the water pump back on here again, and I look back here against the case, between the case and the pump, because I wanted to find a spot where I had room for a bolt I didn't want the water pump to come down and hit the head of the bolt. And hopefully you can see I've center punched a mark right there. That's where I'm going to drill and tap this for M6 by 1.0. Everything's fitting the contours of the case pretty well now. These fit together tight, and I want them to stay that way. So I'm at least going to tack these together while they're bolted to the case. I may do this whole side of the weld, I'm not sure yet. I had to grind most of the weld off on the back side here because otherwise it would interfere with the fit around this corner, but I still felt better having a weld there. So now I'm going to try and bolt this back on, get everything set up. With it set up now, it looks like the 150 belt is way too tight. In fact, it's so tight that it's trying to pull the whole water pump at an angle there. I'm not sure if you can really tell this in the camera shot, but it's kind of twisting the whole water pump this way. So I'll see what happens with a 160. It may be that I need to add even more to this bracket. It's definitely better using a 160 belt because then I can set the tension where I want it and it's not pulling so hard on the water pump. It's not trying to twist it. But I think I should beef up this bracket a bit here. I thought 1/8 inch steel was going to be sufficient, but right now it's looking like it's not, obviously because it could twist it. I'm thinking the easiest way to do that would probably be basically just to build a second plate, this outer plate here, build a second one out of 1/8 inch steel. It could possibly just bolt on, but most likely I'll weld it in place. I cut a second plate and I've tested it out, and the 150 XL belt is now way tight because it's so rigid. The good news is this second plate here, making it a 1/4 inch thick, did take out a lot of the flex. I tried to cut a little notch here in this part of the bracket because the flange, this part of the water pump, would run into that when it was trying to move this way all the way up against the case. That helped a little bit, and then I realized that the pump is also contacting right in this area. So I'm going to go ahead and start welding these two pieces of bracket together, and I'll also kind of match them up a little better. I'm going to grind off this section and see if it is possible after that to get the 150 belt to work, or if I'm going to have to move to a longer belt like the 160 XL. I ground this area down. I took a little bit more out of this section, and it did allow the pump to swing in a little bit more. Unfortunately, I don't think it matters because the 150 belt is still really tight. So you can see I can get the thing on there. When I tighten it up, it's not pulling it so hard to twist the water pump. I think it still might be twisting a little bit, but it's just way too tight. I would have to totally redesign this bracket if I wanted to use the 150 belt. I was hoping that was going to be the answer because that puts a nice alignment between these two ports here, but it's just not going to happen, so I'm going to have to move up to the 160, and hopefully the hose will be able to bend far enough. Here's the 160 belt. I think that's a decent amount of tension. I may even be able to back it off a little bit, but it aligns pretty well. The pulley actually sets pretty far inward on here, so I may be able to cut some of this off later. So really my only question is if I can get the hose to work to go from here to here. The bends required to make that work weren't as bad as I thought they were going to be. I figured I was probably going to end up kinking a hose with that poor alignment there, but it actually seems fine, so I probably just wasted a bunch of time trying to grind and cut away more to make the 150 work when the 160 seems to be just fine on there. So I think from here, the next thing I'm going to do is just make sure I've got these belts, these pulleys aligned well, and it appears that the pulley's going to be pretty far inward on the crank. So most likely I'm going to shave off the end of this because it's pretty much unnecessary at this point. And from there, I'd like to take both of those off and put a coat of paint on there so maybe they don't rust so quickly. I've got this painted, and before it goes on I'm going to use some medium strength blue thread locker because I just don't trust it without something to try and lock it in place, just in case the water pump, the belt, does try to loosen it up. And I'm also going to put a piece of, looks like I missed a spot. Anyway, also going to put a piece of masking tape around here. I know it's a little bit of a loose fit, and I figure maybe that will save a little bit of the paint. Perhaps when I try to tighten it. Now I just need to make the connection between the inlet of the pump and the hose coming from my radiator. So I've got another one of these 90-degree bends and then a piece of tubing to use to couple those. It's hovering about 1/4 of an inch over the cylinder head and the cylinder here, and then I've got it zip tied to the hose, the other hose, and to the frame down there because I don't want this to kink if it gets pulled around. And hopefully it's ready to put some water and coolant in here and see how it does. I got a little nervous for a second because when I first started it, no coolant was moving in the system. And with the stock style Minarelli pump, it basically primes itself and starts moving water instantly because it is the lowest point in the system. This pump is a little bit higher, so it did take a minute, but it has started moving water, as hopefully you saw. and it seems to be cooling okay, at least sitting here on the stand. So now the next step is I got to get this thing down on the floor, and basically I want to sit on the scooter and kind of bounce around a little bit because I want to make sure there are no clearance issues when there is suspension travel. Everything seemed alright as well as I could tell with the scooter just on the stand, and that day was in the mid-90s and humid, so it was a good day to try and test the scooter out. So I went ahead and took the scooter for a test run. Coolant temperature stayed between 132 and 137 degrees Fahrenheit while cruising at 40 miles per hour, plus or minus about 2 miles per hour. That's as good as I could expect from any water pump setup that I've ever used on here, especially while the temperature is 95 degrees outside. Around town temperatures were 125 to 135 degrees most of the time that I could stay moving. It did heat up more in areas where I was moving slowly or if I was stuck at red lights. I did see a max of 144 degrees at a red light, but I believe that is more airflow related than coolant flow related because I went to another red light and I turned on my radiator fan and then I didn't see the temperature increase that much. So I think the water pump flow is fine for in town. It's just again a really hot day and sitting still. Sunny day, asphalt is heat soaked, etc. I think it's just a lot. I can't really expect a whole lot more out of it with any water pump that I put on there. Aggressively on the last 4 to 5 miles before I got home because I wanted to see how it would handle that on such a hot day, and it still didn't do bad. The max temperature that it recorded was 154 degrees. The max that I saw when I looked down, I think, was 151 degrees. Most of the time it was right around 150 degrees with a lot of wide open throttle. So that's probably as good as I could expect again from any water pump setup that I've had. On any hot day, I don't recall it ever being cooler than 150 degrees when I'm giving it a lot of gas. So I think the water pump is cooling just fine. The total ride was a little over 34 miles. It stayed cool enough. The belt didn't break. The belt didn't fly off. Nothing like that. Didn't even hear any weird noises from it. But there may be a problem. The belt just doesn't have as much tension as it did before the ride. It didn't get loose enough that it caused me any problems. It's still tight enough to drive the water pump. Didn't overheat or anything like that. But if it keeps getting more and more loose, it would become a problem. I've checked the bolts on here and all of the bolts are tight. I can't move the water pump around. I don't really think that this belt would have stretched that much. My understanding is that these timing belts really shouldn't have much stretch in them. Can't say for sure that that's the case, but if that is the case, then I would assume that it had to change angle just a little bit while I rode, even though again I cannot move this on my own here. So what I'm going to try to do is tighten it back up again, and then I'll take another ride and see if the same thing happens again, because if the same thing happens again, there's no way that the belt is stretching. Maybe I'll just get lucky and it's you can count it as sort of a break-in sort of thing, but we're going to find out. As you can see, the belt loosened up again. It's not excessively loose. It actually feels like it could be a good setting for the belt. It hasn't had any slip or anything that I've noticed. One good thing about this ride was it rained all day, and the temperature was actually about 80 degrees when I got to go out there. So I saw that the coolant temperature stayed between 120 and 130 the entire ride, and even on the way home I was seeing it dip below 120 degrees while cruising. So at least I know that the cooling system is performing very well. I'm kind of wondering if I might get lucky and we could call this self-adjusting. It's not really a proper term for what's happening, but I'm just thinking, will this get more and more loose, or will it get to a point like this and just live happily there? And the only way I really know to find that out for sure is to not try to tighten it up and do a little more riding and see what happens. After 66 miles of riding, so that's in addition to the first 36 miles, and you can see I can almost touch the belt together there in the center of the two pulleys, when before I would have about a ½ inch to 3/4 inch gap there when I put light tension on it this way. And this is getting more loose than I really ever want it to be, because I'm afraid it's getting to the point that it wouldn't take much to get it off of the pulleys and then lose the belt. The one good thing about it is it has shown me that this system can operate at a wide range of tensions, because I've had no cooling issues. In fact, when I was actually riding in the morning, when it was cool, it was running under 120 degrees sometimes. So clearly no issues there. It's still driving the pump. I don't see any sign that it's been slipping. The teeth aren't chewed up. Nothing like that. No fraying. So it seems to still be working just fine as it is, but I don't want to let it keep going and going, getting more and more loose until it eventually comes off of there, or it will start slipping at some point if it doesn't come off. So I am missing one bolt here on this mount, but that still won't let this mount really move around because I've got another bolt back there. That's why I wanted to make sure I had at least 2 bolts in there. So I would assume it must be that the pump is actually swiveling and it's just losing tension as it goes that way. So this single bolt setup just isn't holding it. I thought maybe it'd be alright because that's what Larry was using and that's what the go-karts use. They just have a single bolt, most of what I've seen. But as John 190 Mech pointed out on the forum, the go-karts also only do probably 30-minute to maybe an hour-long races, and then they could go over the whole cart. In this case, if I wanted to take a 2-hour ride, then I'm going to have to deal with the fact that the belt is getting really loose. What I've done is I tensioned the water pump, the belt, the way I wanted it. I tightened it back up, drained the coolant, and then I removed the entire water pump assembly. That way I can work on it off of the scooter where I've got more room. What I'm hoping to do in order to eliminate the pivot that this water pump has is basically to take a piece of steel and weld an additional piece onto the existing bracket and have that either interact with where one of the water pump bolts, the flange bolts for the water pump are, or drill my own hole and put my own bolt or pin in there. I was initially looking at something off the back here, but where the bolt is really interferes with it, this bolt that mounts it to the case. So it makes it kind of hard to set something up that way. I would end up needing a very long bolt and some spacers and such, and it would also restrict access to trying to get this bolt off of the engine. So I'm thinking that I will probably end up mounting it to the front part of the flange here just ahead of the flange. Now the bad part of that is, because this is not flat, if I put anything there, it won't allow me to rotate the pump very much. So it will mean that I have to put the belt on under tension, but I think it's an altogether better idea. And the reason that I want to drill my own hole in here is because I've taken this apart to look at the bolts that are in the flange, and these are M4 bolts, so they're only 3.9 millimeters outside diameter, and even smaller if you measure the inside, the minor diameter. Not something that I want to take a lot of stress, especially when I make the bolts even longer than this. This is an M5 just for comparison, and I think the M5 is probably as big as I'm going to get away with. Reason being, there is an O-ring in here to seal the rear part to the water pump body, the flange to the body. And obviously you don't want to drill a hole or have something going all the way up against where that water pump is. You want to leave a little bit of room. So I can't go a whole lot larger than they have here with the holes in the flange. So I'm probably going to try to use an M5 and come up with something on the front here to interact with a hole there in the water pump flange. And that'll pretty much lock it in place. The only really bad thing there is that I won't really be able to pivot the pump in order to make it easy to put the belt on. So I'll have to kind of work the belt on there. But that's not really a big deal if this works out. Well, I just screwed that up. If you look here, you can see this mark that's going across. That's supposed to be the center of this circle this way. And clearly I missed that by quite a bit. I decided that instead of trying to take a bunch of time figuring out how I would set this thing up in a drill press, because it's kind of awkward to hold this all together, that I could just hand drill it and it would be close enough. And yeah, it looked okay over here. I thought, well, whatever, it's good enough. And then when I look at this side, not so much. It is right up against the body of the water pump. So now there's no way you can really pin that, bolt it, or anything, because it's right up against there. Luckily, when I made this extra piece, I wanted it to swing in and have the pump housing rest right up against it. So I think I'll be fine, and I'll be able to get away with just having the housing rest against this. That way it cannot push any further in. My only concern is hopefully the vibration doesn't make the bracket cut into the aluminum pump housing. Not exactly sure how that's going to work. It may be that I end up needing to replace the pump or come up with another solution. For right now, I think I'm just going to try it this way and find out what happens. I've got the bracket painted and it's drying now. While I'm waiting for that, I need to take care of these threads in this mounting bolt hole, because they are in really rough shape. So I'm going to try to install a time cert. And if you're not familiar with those, that's essentially a alternative to a helicoil. Basically, this will have to be drilled out and tapped, and then I install this metal insert into there. You can see that's definitely more loose than when I initially installed this thing, but after seeing how loose it could run, I thought this might be better. So that's where I am right now before riding. And I would assume with it resting up against here, as long as it doesn't eat into the pump or something like that, and nothing breaks or comes loose, it should be able to maintain that tension, because the only way it really should be able to rotate would be outward, and it wouldn't want to do that because that would be tightening it, putting more tension on the belt, and it would resist doing that. So as long as it doesn't eat through the water pump there, and that hole that I made doesn't create a leak, hopefully I will be good to go. But got to get this thing back in the scooter, get fluid, coolant back in it, and then I'll try to test it out. I have a feeling a lot of you already know what happened, but it just blew a belt. So I pulled over. It took me about 15 to 20 minutes to change it on the side of the road, and this is all that was left of the belt. Sadly, I had just changed this thing out at 182 miles ago exactly. So that's kind of been another issue with the Hyper Race stuff and all of the more powerful stuff, is I'm blowing belts now between 100 and 200 miles most of the time, so I don't get a whole lot of life out of a $30-ish belt. But anyway, I got back on the road and continued my ride. Here's what the water pump belt looks like after the 63-mile ride. So, pretty close to what it was before I left. It seems to be maybe a little more slack, but it has broken off this mount bolt here. So the last time that one backed itself out or something, it was gone when I came home, and then this time it has broken it off. With the water pump off, you can see that there's a little bit of damage here where the bracket, this piece of the bracket, interacted with the water pump to try and hold it still. It's not terrible, but it's something that needs to be taken care of. I think probably the easy way would be basically to add another piece on here that came out like this, and sort of to cup this area instead of having just one thin line there to kind of cover just this area, you know, give it more surface area to ride against. And that may be enough to stop that. I bent this piece of 1/8 inch steel around a large piece of round bar to give it a good curvature and make a nice cradle for this pump. That way it has a lot of support there instead of just that edge. And while I was at it, I went ahead and added an external support here. Instead of just the one that I originally had on there, I added this piece on as well. I've kind of had a history, as you've seen, of adding just the bare minimum to this bracket and then having to go back, so I figured I'd just take care of this right now, and that should be nice and sturdy. I'm assuming that the reason that I keep breaking the bolts off that go through this hole is because of a misalignment or some sort of tension on the bracket. That is very common, especially happens in exhausts a lot on these things. But if you put tension kind of built into the bracket, so you have to push the bracket or something like that and use the bolt to hold it in place that way, that tension can be enough to break bolts. It can crack brackets and all sorts of things. So I put the rear bolt in back here, and it looks like there could possibly be a very small misalignment. of this hole and the hole in the engine case. Doesn't look like it's very far off to me, but I'm going to go ahead and drill this one size larger, and hopefully it will stop breaking off bolts or stripping out threads. At least as far as I can tell, there isn't tension on the bracket or the bolts now. And when I put this cradle in place, I actually cut the pre-existing piece in the back there a little shorter than it was because I wanted to put a piece of rubber in here. I thought I had a piece of 16th inch thick rubber, and so I took away a little bit to accommodate for that, just for some extra padding basically, hopefully to ensure it doesn't cut into the pump. And I was wrong, apparently I didn't have the rubber. But if you look here, hopefully you can see, I've got a piece of 1/16 of an inch thick rubberized gasket material in place there for now. Don't know if it's really necessary, but that puts it to roughly the belt tension that I'd like and gives it at least some cushion, hopefully. So now I'm going to paint this thing for, I think, the third time now, and when the weather clears up, I'll go do some more test rides. Well, I rode 50 miles and all of my bolts are still here. They're still intact, they're still tight, and the belt is still snug. No problems there with the belt tension. It may be slightly more loose than it was before, but that is because it appears that my little gasket material up here has disappeared. I don't think that's any big deal, but I'm going to go ahead and swing the pump out and take a look just to make sure it's not cutting into the pump. I can't move the pump too far out without having to remove the hoses and drain all of the coolant, but I've got in there and took a good look, and I don't see any signs of wear on the pump or even on the bracket, which surprises me. I thought it would at least take the paint off the bracket, but all of that stuff seems to be fine. I'm up to 249 miles on the XL belt now from all of my test rides, and I measured the width of that versus my two new belts that I have, replacement belts that are exactly the same. And it looks like it's lost maybe 0.2 of a millimeter. So this runs about 9.2 to 9.25 millimeters. And these will run up close to 9.5 millimeters at the widest point, and down to about 9.3 something millimeters. They're not as consistent in the width as I thought they would be. But at any rate, looks pretty decent that way. Now looking at the teeth or the cogs on this side of the belt, this is the old belt up front and the new belt in the back. I measured the thickness of some of these, and it doesn't look like it's lost more than a couple hundredths of a millimeter there, as far as the thickness across one of these cogs or teeth. So that's pretty good, and overall this may feel slightly more dull than the brand new belt, but there really doesn't seem to be much difference there. So I think the belt is holding up pretty well for roughly 250 miles. It's cooling well, it's able to maintain belt tension without wearing anything. I'm not seeing nuts or bolts back off or break off anymore. The belt isn't wearing quickly. I haven't seen it back the crankshaft nut off, and everything appears to be running true. So I believe I can call it a working setup for now. Who knows what tomorrow brings? The whole thing could blow apart tomorrow. No idea. But it looks like I might finally have this set up and working well for me. With that said, I'm going to wrap this video up. As always, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.